Now that the Elden Ring DLC has been here for a little while and kind of solidified, and I've gotten a chance to try out all the new summons, I figured it was time to rank them all. Now, I have quite a lot of experience with the summon only challenges that are already up on my channel, so I do feel moderately qualified to rank the summons fairly objectively. Now, ultimately, all tier lists are decided mostly by the opinions of the person making them. There's no exception here. But I've done a couple things to hopefully try and make this a little bit more data driven and objective than the average tier list. First, I've obviously analyzed all of their stats and the different status effects they can apply, how many specific use cases they have. But I've also gone ahead and run every summon at plus 10 against Morgott on a regular new game. They got no help at all, no buffs, no heals, no nothing. I just was in the arena and tried to stay out of the way. And this allowed me to assess all of their performance, their AI. But in addition, it gave me a very nice Morgott meter, which I'm hopefully going to display on the screen for every summon, as long as that's not too much work. But otherwise is in a Google Doc, which is linked down below. In addition, there's a lot more info on a more detailed Reddit post I made, also linked down below. That being said, there are 84 summons. This is going to take a while, so no more intro, let's just get into it. Starting with the number 1 slot, Wandering Noble Ashes. These guys cost only 28 FP and have a pretty good amount of stagger because they've got a large number of summons, but they're just the little Wandering Noble NPCs. They're not that great. It had a surprisingly good Morgott meter turnout, to be honest, but I'm still giving them C tier. The Noble Sorcerer Ashes in spot number 2. Coming in at only 11 FP, this guy is awful. I seriously give him the title of the worst summon in the game. He is a support summon who is supposed to stay back from range, but he doesn't really do that. He has maybe the lowest poise out of any summon that I've ever seen, so he usually can't get off more than 1 or 2 spells before getting permanently stun locked. He's awful. Don't run him. F tier. Next up, the Nomad Ashes. This guy is okay. He spits out some Madness Fire, which is alright if enemies are vulnerable to that, and comes in at 61 FP, which is a substantial amount. But his damage just really isn't all that much. He did okay on the Morgott meter, but not great. He is pretty vulnerable to stagger, and the madness effect he can apply doesn't really actually apply to most bosses. Wouldn't really recommend using him, but he's C tier, situational. Next up, the Putrid Corpse Ashes. Coming in at 40 FP, these guys are very, very slow moving. However, they have somewhat decent damage if they can actually connect to a boss, and very high health, all things considered. That being said, they move so slowly, they rarely grab boss aggro, and often bosses are literally ignoring them to go after you, moving around the map so fast they do nothing. D tier. Coming up next is the Skeletal Militiaman Ashes, and I'm going to group these with the Skeletal Bandit Ashes. The Skeletal Militiaman cost 44, and the Skeletal Bandit cost 22. Now, the Skeletal Militiaman do a little bit more damage than the Skeletal Bandit, because there are 2 of them, so they also draw aggro a little bit better. But both of these have kind of the same pro and con. They're both pretty vulnerable to stagger, but they both have a bonus, which is when they die, they can resurrect, unless enemies hit them during the process of their resurrection. Some bosses are not smart enough to do this, and in that case, these guys are incredibly good because they're more or less immortal. That being said, a lot of bosses have AoE that'll accidentally hit them, and many are just straight up smart enough to hit them while they're respawning. So, these guys are C tier only because of the niche scenarios where they're actually good because the bosses aren't smart. In most cases, you could probably count these guys D tier. But I'm giving them C anyway for those niche use cases. Next up, the Albinauric, Frog Dudes, Ashes. Coming in at 53 FP, these guys have a surprisingly high damage output. They also apply Frostbite, kind of very mobile, frequently dodging boss attacks. Sounds great, so what's wrong? Problem is actually that movement I mentioned earlier. These guys move very weird and unpredictably, and often miss their actual damaging attacks. I almost never see them actually fill up the Frostbite status effect, even though they hypothetically could. They do surprisingly well on the Morgott meter, but it's still pretty underwhelming. I think they got lucky on the run I gave them against Morgott, and on average, they're going to perform a lot worse. C tier. Next up, the Winged Misbegotten. This is a flying type enemy who costs only 37 FP to summon. Now, some bosses can't deal with flying enemies, so that automatically gives him a bump, but most can. However, he is very squishy and gets staggered very easily, which gives him a bump down. His final bump up is that he is a hybrid, which means he has both a melee and a ranged attack. All in all, his damage is still pretty low, even though his FP cost is also pretty low. So I'm going to generously give him C tier, but he's definitely going to need a lot of help to do a whole lot. Next up, the Demi-Human Ashes. These little monkey dudes cost 69 FP, nice, and are surprisingly effective. They have a lot of stagger, are fairly resistant, very aggressive, can buff each other, and really quite reliable. That being said, they are relatively low in terms of hit points total, and therefore probably won't last the entire fight, and definitely need help or buffs if you're expecting them to be a significant presence for the large duration of the fight. All in all, their pathing and AI is pretty good, and they're our first B tier. Next up, the Clayman Ashes. At 77 FP, I was very much prepared to hate these guys, and I hadn't actually used them that much before making this video. I was very pleasantly surprised at both their health and damage output. Their spells do very respectable damage. Granted, they were at plus 10, but still, these guys did very well on the Morgott meter, a lot better than I was expecting. Like all ranged support summons, they do suffer quite a bit if the boss actually gets on top of them, but less so than I expected, because they still usually get their spells off before getting staggered. I'm putting these guys all the way up at B tier. I'm not really sure they're the best support summon to use, but I'd recommend trying them out at least once, especially if you're fairly comfortable you're going to be able to beat the boss. Next up are the Oracle Envoy Ashes. These guys cost 72 FP, and you get 4 of the little dudes who go out and spit the little horns with the bubbles. They are fine. They have moderately reliable damage, although bosses do like to dodge the little projectiles if the summons are particularly far away, meaning that to get reliable damage, they need to get closer, which means they're going to draw aggro, and you don't really want that for a support summon. They are horrible in large arenas. They just can't really do anything, won't keep up with the boss, so they're really only even usable on the smaller arenas. I'm putting them in C. Just use the Clayman. Well, probably shouldn't use either of them, but of the two, I'd recommend the Clayman. Next up, our very first DLC summon with the Man-Fly Ashes. At only 28 FP, these guys are actually pretty damn good for the cost. They are moderately reliable at applying at least one instance of the poison status effect, are pretty aggressive, but have pretty low hit points. However, for only 28 FP, they are probably the second most FP effective summon in terms of damage per FP. Nothing beats the Rat's literally 0 summon cost, but these guys really surprise me for the better. Don't get me wrong, these guys aren't going to solo carry any boss like Mimic tier, but they're pretty good. I'd definitely recommend giving them a try. B tier. Next up, the Lone Wolves at 55 FP. These guys are fairly decent, if not particularly remarkable. They tend to spread out, which is good, less vulnerable to AoE attacks, and have decent damage and stagger. Definitely need your help to do a whole lot. But they are more reliable than a lot of the worst summons, and pretty predictable in their behavior. So you're not very often going to wonder what on earth they're doing as they're standing out in the corner just thinking about their next move. They're just going to be biting the boss. Because of that, they just barely eke it into B tier. Next up, the Rotten Stray Ashes. At 35 FP, this guy has one purpose. Apply Scarlet Rot, and then die. If you really need Scarlet Rot, it's good. Otherwise, it's pretty bad. I really can't think of anything else to say other than this guy is C tier, situational, use him if you really need Rot. Alright, next up, the Giant Rat Ashes. Coming in at a whopping 0 FP cost, these guys are literally free to summon. That also means they're free to upgrade. Other than, of course, the crafting component cost. These guys also have a pretty unique bonus in that the more you upgrade them, the more rats you get. To my knowledge, this is the only summon in the game that works like this. At level 10, you'll get a full 5 rats. They also have a fixed spawn location in each map, which is kind of a pro and a con. It means they often spawn in the middle and draw boss aggro a lot quicker, but it also means you can't easily apply buffs to them before the boss starts hitting them. That being said, for literally free, you get fairly decent damage, better than a lot of the more expensive ones we've already covered, and a reliable damage sponge for the early game. We're pretty much always going to draw the aggro right at the start. The 0 FP cost alone probably would have me putting these guys in B tier, but everything else pushes them all the way to A tier. It literally costs you nothing to try these guys out. Following up, we have the Warhawk Ashes. This guy costs 52 FP and is a bird summon. That, of course, means that some bosses can't really deal with him too well and they're not smart enough to target in the air. He is pretty aggressive, spews fire, which is good against some bosses, and unfortunately is fairly easily staggered by the bosses who can deal with him. His damage is respectable. All things considered, the fact that he's a bird gives him a B tier. Not much to say, though. Probably not the best bird, and I feel like the bird meta has fallen a little bit out of fashion. They seem to have buffed the boss AI to be a little better at dealing with them. Following up, we have the Squirt Ashes. These guys are pretty unique. They cost 240 hit points and have a fixed spawn location. They spew out gas, which applies the poison status effect and does a lot more damage than you would expect. They're also pretty tanky, but they need it because these guys pretty much can't move. They move a very tiny amount, but they're going to stay almost exactly where they get started summoning, right in the middle of the map. This is very situational. Some bosses is going to be pretty good, and some bosses is going to be pretty terrible. Morgott was one where they were actually very good. You might find this is a shockingly good Morgott meter. I mean, seriously, it should be on the screen. They got him over half health all on their own. I really slept on these guys, and to be fair, because of their fixed spawn, they're very situational. Some bosses they're going to be terrible against. Don't even think about bringing these guys against Fire Giant. But small arenas where the boss is going to get close, these guys are shockingly good. These guys are in a B tier fairly easily. Next up, everybody's lovely Spirit Jellyfish Ashes at 31 FP. Man, this guy, I wish he were good. He's a ranged guy. He can apply poison, but it's not very reliable. His damage is very low. His attacks are slow, vulnerable to stagger. You need to keep enemies away from him, or he's pretty much gone instantly. Listen, I love this guy, but he's just not that great. I've got to put him in C tier. Next up, the Miranda Sprout Ashes. These guys are pretty similar to the Squirt Ashes, but only cost 105 hit points and spawn next to you. They move more than the Squirts, but they also only shake their poison kind of in front of them, rather than targeted at an enemy. This is really kind of just a worse version of the Squirts. Everything these guys do, the Squirts do better. They've got a C tier because they still manage to apply poison and do much better damage than you might think, but just use the Squirt Ashes, man. Coming up, we've got our next DLC summon, the Spider Scorpion Ashes. These guys look really cool and cost 31 FP. Unfortunately, he's not really good. Hypothetically, he can apply poison, but realistically, from my practice, that doesn't really happen. He's got low health, easily staggered, and low damage. This guy is not amazing. He does get those DLC damage buffs that all the DLC summons seem to have gotten, which ekes him into C tier from a D tier, but he's not very good. Next up, we've got the Fingercreeper Ashes, and these guys I'm pretty torn on. They are, believe it or not, a support summon. Their main purpose seems to be healing you. They do a little bit of range damage and are very, very vulnerable to fire. That makes them very situational. If they get any fire damage, they roll around on the ground, completely useless for a while. They cost 55 FP, and their heals are actually pretty good, but they aren't going to scale super amazing until later New Game Pluses. I'm really torn on whether to put these guys in B or C tier because of the healing and the sustain they have for both themselves and you. But their many weaknesses and everything probably force me to put them in C tier. But I'm really torn here. So C or B tier. I'm saying C for now, but there's an argument for a higher tier. Next up, the Fanged Imp Ashes. At 50 FP, these guys are a potential start of the game option. They unfortunately really only have one purpose, which is get bleed procs in the early game. They don't scale very well. If they don't actually proc their bleed, it's pretty worthless and they do nothing. I have to put them in C tier because they have the ability to proc bleed, but they're one of the least reliable summons that have that ability. I generally wouldn't recommend them very often outside of the early game. However, next up we have the Bigmouth Imp Ashes, another DLC summon. Also costing 50 FP, this guy shoots a big ass cannon right out of his mouth. This has pretty high stagger and very good damage, and he tends to keep his distance pretty well. Though, of course, if the boss gets on top of him, things aren't great. All in all, this guy is still pretty incredible, and I would say arguably the best range support the DLC added. Guy gets an easy A tier. He's great. Significantly better than the Fanged Imp Ashes in every way. I love this guy, and he's probably going to become one of my new staples. Next up, we have the Gravebird Ashes, and this is another summon I'm pretty torn on. It is a bird tier summon, so everything I've said before about some bosses not being able to target birds correctly applies again. He is very aggressive, a lot more so than the other bird summons, and has pretty high damage. But he has pretty low health and a giant hitbox. This does kind of hurt him, though, because it negates a pretty big advantage that a lot of other bird summons have, which is that the bosses can't hit them very easily. I'm pretty torn between C and B tier for this summon. I'm going to put him in C tier right now, but I really could see an argument for B tier due to his slightly higher than average damage, but did not perform very good on the Morgott meter in my testing, and I'm just not convinced that this is really the stellar summon I've seen some people say. He is mid at best. Next up, the Soldjars of Fortune Ashes. These guys cost 135 hit points and look like they should be pretty good. They actually have a lot better damage than you might think, but they have a pretty gigantic design flaw which cripples them. So these guys are vulnerable to fire. If they take pretty much any fire damage, they self-destruct, which does do some damage, I guess. Their gigantic flaw is that this self-destruct can also be triggered by one of the other guys' self-destruct, meaning that if one of these guys dies, they all die, meaning they really only have the weakest link's health bar. That is just pretty inexcusable. It makes these guys pretty much unusable. These guys get D tier. Moving on, we've got the Archer Ashes, and they cost 57 FP. As you might expect, they're archers. Hypothetically, these guys can apply Frostbite, but I really don't see that happening very often. They fire pretty slow. They do spread out, so they're not super vulnerable to AoE attacks, but have pretty low stagger. So when the boss inevitably does get on them, because they don't stand that far away, they're not going to be much more useful. If you can keep the boss off of them, they're still not horrible, but I'm giving them C tier. Next up, the Greatshield Soldier Ashes. These guys are awesome. Their shields make them block quite a lot of damage. They cost 74 FP, and they throw pots, which I think are supposed to deal a status, but realistically I've never seen them proc anything. That being said, their damage is quite good. They can overwhelm a boss and stagger him, and don't even really get punished for it because they've got their shields up to block. Unfortunately, their health is pretty low, and if an enemy does happen to get behind them, they are going to melt them like nothing else. That being said, these guys are probably one of the best soldier type ashes. Very, very good, especially against enemies that just have like a sword. They're extremely good, especially if you're actually fighting along with them and not making them do all the work. These guys get an A tier. Next up, we've got the Page Ashes, and they cost 81 FP. If I had to describe these guys in one word, it is mid. He is maybe the most boring basic summon there is. He is a hybrid. He's got a crossbow and a sword. He kind of just does everything other summons do, but okay instead of good. Got okay Morgott meter damage, okay range damage, okay local damage. C tier. He's fine. Now next up we've got the Vulgar Militia Ashes. These guys cost 70 FP and are a very, very aggressive summon. They do a lot of leaping and jumping. They can hypothetically apply poison, though realistically not very often, but they can very reliably proc bleed. They do pretty good damage, pretty good stagger, but are very squishy. I'm pretty torn on these guys. I'm putting them B tier, but there's a solid argument for A tier due to how reliably they proc bleed. As I said, it is very debatable, but I think they're low health. The boss can pretty easily hit them despite their low stature. Like their hitboxes are a little bigger than they look, and they get swatted out of the air all the time. So I am putting them B, but I'm not going to get too offended if you think they really should be A, because I can see it. Next up, the Marionette Soldier Ashes. These guys cost 67 FP and are Archer Ashes. They don't really apply any statuses, however, they do attack pretty fast and have fairly reliable damage. They do tend to get pretty close to the boss, which means they are going to get staggered and are going to have a hard time surviving the whole fight, but their high base damage does mean that even when they get close to the boss, they're going to deal a lot of damage out before they die. Considering they're a support summon, I'm putting them B tier, but there are better archer summons, but there are also a lot worse. Next up, we have the Avionette Soldier Ashes with 67 FP. These guys are very similar to the Vulgar Militia Ashes, but kind of just a little bit worse. They apply fire damage instead of poison. They still proc bleed, but slightly less reliably than the Vulgar Militia. They still move erratically just like the Vulgar Militia. These guys are just a worse Vulgar Militia. Vulgar Militia were arguably A tier, but I put them B tier. These guys are just solidly B tier. Next up, the Kaiden Sellsword Ashes. This guy costs 88 FP and has a sword, and he hits enemies. He is moderately tanky and has respectable, if not particularly impressive damage, and a moderately high FP cost. I'm putting this guy in B tier. He is a decent summon, especially in the early game, but he kind of just pales in comparison to a lot of the other summons, which are guys with a sword. He doesn't really do anything particularly special that they can't. So, kind of just a slightly worse version of a lot of them. That's why he gets B tier. Next up, the Mad Pumpkinhead Ashes at 110 FP. This guy is very aggressive and procs bleed, in addition to his infamous head slam attack. Something else unique about this boss is that his big helmet basically works as a free shield. If bosses hit the helmet instead of his body, they take greatly reduced damage as if you were blocking with a shield. And I don't believe it contributes to staggering him. He's also just hilarious to watch fight, and does respectable damage, especially if you're there to back him up. All in all, I'd say this guy gets a fairly solid A tier. Next up, the Fire Monk Ashes. Coming in at 85 FP, this guy is alright. If an enemy is particularly vulnerable to fire, he's pretty good, because he does a lot of fire damage. If they're not, he's not great, because he does a lot of fire damage. He is pretty easily interrupted. but has a pretty good amount of health. Uh, all in all, kind of just fine. C tier. Next up, the Ancestral Follower Ashes. This guy comes in at 63 FP and is a pretty good hybrid summon. His arrows have surprisingly high stagger and a pretty good, basically, audio cue that you can listen for to know they're coming. And he still does respectable damage in his melee form. He is maybe one of the more reliable hybrids due to the fact that both of his forms are good, but his archer summon is definitely better than the melee summon, and it can be awkward to get the boss far enough away from him to force him to actually switch into archer mode. He still just ekes it into A tier due to his high stagger from his arrows, making him pretty good against people like Militia, especially if you're there to help him. But he certainly doesn't top out our archers. Next up, we have the Honed Warrior Ashes from the DLC. This guy costs 101 FP and is incredible. I really can't understate it. This guy is aggressive. He has magic attacks. He is fast. He has high health. He has high stagger. He pretty much uses all of those stupid bullshit abilities he used against you that you could barely counter against the bosses. It's awesome to see him fight. He takes pressure off of you. This guy is great. The only thing keeping him from S tier is the fact that he doesn't have any ability that basically does any max health percent damage and isn't very reliable at proccing status effects. So he doesn't scale well into the late game. New game pluses, say new game plus 5, new game plus 6. This guy's going to really fall off compared to a lot of the other summons. So or I wouldn't say a lot, compared to the S tier summons, which puts him very much at the top of A tier. But do not let me understate this. This guy is incredible, especially if you're at a lower New Game Plus or not on a New Game Plus. This guy will carry you like few other summons ever can. Moving on, we have the Azula Beastman Ashes. Coming in at 102 FP, these guys are a pretty reliable source of bleed and very aggressive. That being said, their health is pretty low, all things considered, and outside of bleed, they don't have a lot going for them. They also tend to group up, making them very vulnerable to AoE attacks. That being said, their aggression and bleed is not bad, and I'm putting them in B tier. Coming up next, we have the Man-Serpent Ashes. This snake dude costs 62 FP and does fire AoE damage. Sounds pretty good. Thing is, most bosses don't really care about AoE, and this guy is not very good at single target damage. Hypothetically, if a boss is weak to fire, you could bring him along, but Fire Monk and a lot of other summons are going to do a better job there. This guy just doesn't really have a lot going for him that can actually help you, other than the fact that he can do his long, extend his own body move to hit a boss from far away, but that's really not that helpful, and he still has pretty low poise and gets staggered all the time. This guy's going in D tier. Coming up next is the Crystalian Ashes. These guys come in at 101 FP and is a little more than meets the eye. The damage on this boss is fairly low compared to its cost, but what helps it a lot is its hyper armor. This boss takes almost 0 damage with an asterisk. Until his poise is broken for the first time, we're going to basically be near invulnerable. Even Millennia, the DLC bosses are going to be doing trinkets of damage to this person. Almost nothing. It's like he's invulnerable. And all the while, he's chugging through, dealing damage out like it's no tomorrow. Unfortunately, as soon as the poise is broken the first time, the summon becomes a wet rag. Damage will stay the same, but this guy goes from taking almost no damage to taking bonus damage from everything. So you definitely need to keep the boss from hitting them too much in a row so that you can really prolong how long it takes before the poise is broken and your ultra tanky summon becomes a literal glass cannon. As well as a crystal cannon. Despite that, they're pretty good at pulling aggro and incredibly tanky, so they still get an A tier, despite their timer on their health, I guess you can put it, in regards to the poise. Next up, we have the Kindred of Rot Ashes. At 73 FP, this is maybe the most situational support summon there is. But when that condition is met, this guy is very, very good. Because this summon frequently casts Pest Threads on bosses that have a very, very big hitbox, think Fire Giant, Pest Threads can hit multiple times, doing incredible damage, especially given the moderately low FP cost. That being said, on small fast bosses, don't bring this guy. He will not be helpful. However, due to his insane utility on the big bosses that there are in this game, I am putting him at B tier. And yes, I am biased because this guy was able to beat Fire Giant on his own. Next up, we've got the Blood Fiend Hexer, another DLC summon. This guy costs 110 hit points and does a lot of basically Mohg's Blood Flame incantations. So he can apply bleed and does fire damage. He is basically a range support. He's not very good in melee range. You don't want to get him in melee range. But I am struggling to find the situations where he's really good. I think he can be, but I haven't really found them from my playing. Because of that, I'm torn. Because I think he's got a lot of potential, and I want to put him in B tier. But I haven't been able to actually get him to realize that potential in my testing. So I think he does deserve a C tier until that potential gets unlocked. But I really think it can be unlocked. Next up, we have the Glintstone Sorcerer. At 49 FP, this guy sucks. He is easily staggered, has low damage, but better than a Noble Sorcerer, and is frequently walks up into melee range of the boss, despite the fact that he is a ranged summon and doesn't get any more casts off. Because he technically does a lot more damage than the Noble Sorcerer, I'm putting him in D tier very generously, but this guy is not good. He sucks. Coming up next, we have the Twin Sage Sorcerer Ashes. This guy costs 89 FP and is notably better than the Glintstone Sorcerer for only one reason. He has a shotgun spell, which is pretty good at close range. Outside of that, he is terrible. Easily staggered, constantly gets close range with the boss, still pretty low damage, and he costs more FP despite the fact that he's not a lot better. He also gets a very generous D tier. Next up, the Inquisitor Ashes. These guys are a new DLC summon and cost 67 FP. These guys are maybe the quintessential support summon. They cast a lot of buffs that both make them take less damage and heal you. And that healing is what really makes these guys shine, because it's not their damage, believe me. However, both of these guys can cast a heal, which can work on you, but also works on each other. Meaning, even if one of them is getting wailed on by the boss, the other one can heal to keep them alive, and vice versa. Hypothetically, if you keep the boss off of these guys enough, I feel like they're pretty much immortal. I really don't see a scenario where the boss is in any way not permanently targeting these guys and they ever die, because they cast their heal all the time. Seriously, I love these guys. They're probably my favorite healing support of the game. Not that there's that many healing supports in the game to begin with, so I suppose that's a pretty low bar. All in all, I might be a little biased here. I see a lot of people rate these guys pretty low. I'm putting them at A tier. I think if you use these guys correctly, they're essentially immortal due to them healing each other nonstop. Alright, we got a lot of soldiers to get through, so I'm going to make each one pretty short. First up, Godric Soldjars, 54 FP. These guys are pretty good. They have a ranged summon and a melee summon and do okay on damage and pretty decent on tanking. They get B tier. Next up, Rhea Lucaria Soldjars, 59 FP. These guys have one ranged summon and two melee summons. Pretty much just a bit better than the Godric Soldjars. These guys also get a B tier. Pretty decent. Kind of weird that the guy with the big sword is the ranged one, though. Next up, the Lindell Soldjars. 64 FP is notably higher, and they're also notably worse. The shields mean they actually just get staggered a lot and end up doing a lot less damage, though they still end up being a little tankier than the previous ones because of that. They still get a C tier. Next up, the Radon Soldjars. These guys cost 71 FP, but justify the cost. Before the DLC came out, these guys were the best soldier type there was. They do fire damage, are pretty good, pretty aggressive, and pretty tanky. Not enough to really solo carry, but a very fine complement to any build. B tier. Next up, the Haligtree Soldjars at 66 FP. These guys have very high damage, and honestly, we're on track to be a great summon. They have one clearing problem that, however, is pretty inexcusable. When they get low, they self-destruct. Already kind of bad, but they only do it when they're low, right? Wrong. If one of them actually self-destructs, he will trigger his self-destructs on everybody else near him, meaning that, once again, they're only as strong as their weakest link. As soon as one of them dies, they're pretty much all dead. Not great for a summon that's a bunch of small guys who don't do a lot of damage individually. C tier. Next up, the Malmuseum Soldjars. At 75 FP, these guys are pretty unique because they phase in and out of existence, which is actually pretty decent. They dodge a lot of boss attacks. Unfortunately, it means they drop boss aggro a lot, and to compensate for the fact that they can dodge a bunch of attacks, they have a lot lower health than normal, and seem to do a little bit lower damage. All in all, they actually die in about the same time as the rest of the soldiers. Still making it into B tier because of their uniqueness, but not as good as they sound. The last of the Soldier Ashes, the Mesmer Soldjars. These DLC summons cost 66 FP and are really good. I mean, seriously, their damage is really high. They do flame damage. They don't do a whole lot else, but they're very aggressive. They keep aggro, and their health is a lot higher than the other soldiers, even though there's only two of them. You guys are great. A tier, easily. Alright, the soldiers are out of the way. Moving on to Stormhawk Deenh. This is probably the best bird summon at 47 FP. Like all birds, I've said it many times at this point. Some bosses can't deal with flying enemies. On that cases, this bird is great, and he even buffs you, which the other birds don't, so that's a bonus. That being said, if the boss can hit birds, he's not very good. B tier. Alright, Banished Knight Oleg is next. This summon costs 100 FP, and there's not a lot specifically to say. He has two swords, he has high health, high damage, high tankiness, and pretty high poise, so he doesn't get staggered much. That's the quintessential A tier summon. Always pretty good compliment. Next up, Banished Knight Ingavel. This guy is very similar to Oleg, except he's got a spear and is a bit less tanky and a bit less aggressive. All in all, I don't really know why he also costs 100 FP, but he kind of just performs worse than Oleg in every measure despite their very high similarity. Because of that, giving him B tier. Next up, Bloodhound Knight Flo. Don't really know how to pronounce that. At 95 FP, this guy's a very reliable source of bleed. I wish I could rank him a lot higher because his moveset does make him dodge a lot of enemy attacks. But I think because of that, they gave him a significantly reduced health bar, meaning that unless you are really keeping boss aggro yourself or buffing him and healing him frequently, he's gonna die pretty dang fast. I wish this guy could be higher, I really do, but I can't justify giving him higher than B tier with such a low health pool. Next up from the DLC, Black Knight Captain Hua. This guy has a twin blade and is very aggressive, very fast, and does a lot of abilities to charge in if he does get far away from the boss for every reason. It's kind of a pro and a con because it's often a suicide dive right into a boss's mega attack, but it is nice that he really does keep the aggro, even when it doesn't particularly work. All in all, this guy's got pretty good damage, as you can see by the Morgott meter. I like him. In many ways, I would say he serves a very similar role to Dung Eater pre-DLC. A tier. Next up, Black Knight Commander Andreas. Big hammer, big shield, 108 FP. Somehow, a lot worse than the previous Black Knight. The shield means I feel like he just gets staggered and stuck in a stun lock blocking, even though it does mean he takes longer to die. And his damage is not what you would expect despite the big sword. It just doesn't work very well against most bosses. Don't get me wrong, he's fine. He keeps aggro okay, does okay damage, but for 108 FP, I'm really expecting a bit more from a summon. B tier. Next up, Fire Knight Hilde. At 100 FP, this summon is a surprisingly effective one. I really didn't expect her to be this good. A very good all-rounder summon. Um, Pretty dang high damage, especially if the enemy is weak to fire. Not so much if we're strong against it. Pretty aggressive, pretty nimble, pretty decent poise, though lower than a lot of the human type ones. All in all, I'm very happy with this summon. It vastly exceeded my expectations. I didn't expect to be able to place this summon above B tier, but I feel pretty comfortable putting it in A tier. This is a very reliable DLC summon, and while it might not be the best against some of those DLC bosses, which get crazy aggressive against a regular boss, this is a great summon. Next up, Fire Knight Quillen. You'd think this would be similar to Hildy, but there's a lot of differences. First off, significantly more expensive. He costs 132 FP and is a human type summon, which is a pro and a con because it does mean that he is vulnerable to the boss attacks that would normally only hit you, but he does get the sometimes better human AI. In this case, however, the human AI is not better. I know a lot of people rank this summon pretty high, but in all of my testing, he has done terrible. His average damage is very low. His average tankiness is pretty low. I just really feel like for 132 FP, you should be getting a lot more out of this guy. That is very high. It's one of the highest on this list, and you're really just getting like a okay damage. If it weren't for the extremely high FP cost, it would be a solid B tier. But at 132 FP, this guy does not justify, and because of that, I'm putting him down in C tier. I don't think this is particularly worth it. Next up, Sword Hand of the Night Jolan at 90 FP. This is a pretty decent summon. Another human type 1. This guy pretty reliably applies bleed, although their health is a lot lower than you'd expect, and they're not very good at actually dodging. They typically try and block with their very shitty little shield, which doesn't do a lot. All in all, this is a fairly decent summon, but you shouldn't use it because you can freely switch out between Jolan and Anna. Until you're in a new game plus, you can't have both summons. You have to pick one or the other. You should always do Jolan and Anna. It's better for a lot of ways. Despite that, still okay on its own. B tier. Next up, Jolan and Anna. Everything I said about Jolan applies, but now he also has Anna, who is a range summon. This does bump up the cost to 144 FP. This is the highest in the game, but it deserves it. This is an amazing combo. They synergize great with each other. They'll probably synergize even better with you. Very high damage, pretty reliable at surviving into the later stages of the bosses, and with a few buffs, can probably solo most of the bosses in the base game. The DLC ones are just so overtuned that I'm sure they're going to take a lot of resummoning when it comes around to beating them. But these guys are great. Very expensive, but justifies the cost. Very high A tier. Battle Mage Huge. Battle Mage Battle Mage Hughes. This guy is probably the best mage there is, but that's not saying much. He does come in at a whopping 122 FP for a finally bare minimum mage. The thing that sets this guy apart is he's big, he has very high poise, and several of his spells give him apparently hyper armor, including his big hammer. That being said, his damage isn't that high, and if he weren't the only usable mage in the entire game, for summoning at least, I would probably give him a much lower rating. But the mages need a win, so he gets a pity B tier. Next up, Latenna. At 74 FP, this archer summon cannot move, which, you may not believe it, but is incredible. The summon has very high base damage, and if positioned correctly, Latenna is one of the only summons in the entire game who can solo Millennia, who can solo the final DLC boss, solo pretty much any boss. Snunny on YouTube has a guide showing both of the previous scenarios as well as several more. If you know how to play around Latenna, she can beat any boss on her own, or your money back. This is the best support summon in the game. You do have to know how to play around her, but if you do, she can beat any boss entirely on her own. It's literally amazing. Lieutenant is great. The very first S tier of the entire tier list. And there's not going to be that many of those, so this is a truly prestigious position, and the only support summon to get that. Next up, Perfumer Trisha. At 78 FP, this support summon casts buffs and does kind of AoE fire damage. Problem is, it does neither well. This summon misses all of the time and whiffs almost every single attack. Her AI is terrible. Because of that, D tier. Next up, the cooler Perfumer, Depraved Perfumer Caraman. Now, this guy has 124 FP cost and suffers from all of the previous problems that last Perfumer had. However, he has a self-heal. He uses at least twice, and it's a very significant self-heal. Because of that, he is pretty good at taking boss aggro and living, and that ekes him all the way up to C tier. But the Perfumers, they aren't good, man. Next up, Omen Killer Rolo. This guy is badass and is 113 FP and one of the most reliable bleed procs in the game. Super aggressive, takes the boss aggro, but his health isn't as high as you might expect. He definitely needs help if he really wants to solo any of the bosses. He's going to need a lot of buffs or assistance from you, but he has all the tools he needs to succeed, so he still gets an A tier. Next up, Black Flame Monk Amon. This guy costs 115 FP and may surprise you. You might notice he has the record from every summon we're going to see today on the Morgott meter, and that is well earned. I've slept on this guy for way too long. His damage is incredible. The Black Flame incantations are percent health and very, very good against bosses. And what's even better is that percent health works on New Game Plus, meaning this is one of the very, very few summons who scales well, even if you're playing on New Game Plus 7. This guy's only going to be a little weaker than on New Game Plus 1. He is very, very, very good. And you may not believe it, but this guy gets an S tier. Seriously, you're sleeping on this guy, at least if you're trying to have the summon do the majority of the damage or be a very good supplement. This guy is great. Easy, easy S tier. You're sleeping on him. Next up, Curseblade Mira. At 127 FP, this DLC summon is the guys who antagonize you all throughout the DLC. A tremendous to fight. And they got like nerfed to high hell or something. He's not good. I mean, he has a super high FP cost. His damage is frankly pretty damn low. I'm just not seeing it, man. This guy is mid. I mean it. He's mid. He does not justify his cost. He doesn't reliably proc a lot of stuff. He isn't even particularly dodgy. He gets hit a lot. His health is low. I don't know what they did to nerf this guy so much in his summon form, but he needs some help. B tier. Next up, Demi-Human Swordsman Yosh. At the 69th spot in your inventory, nice. This little Yoda freak costs 95 FP and is fast and aggressive. He blinks to dodge a lot of attacks, but his damage is decent and his health is very low. He isn't OP, but he's certainly very passable, very fun to fight along, pretty good at dodging boss attacks, especially if the boss is slow. But he just really doesn't have the tools he needs to solo anything on his own. He definitely needs help from you. Still, pretty decent B tier. Next up, Ancient Dragon Knight Kristoff. This guy is 108 FP and a lot better than he looks. He's one of the few hybrid summons in the game who feels equally good at both melee and ranged. His melee damage is high, he's got a shield to help tank damage, and at range he casts a bunch of lightning bolts which are very reliable at hitting the boss unless he's in the middle of an attack. This guy is probably the best knight type summon to use. He's just solid. Not much else to say. This guy is an amazing all-rounder summon, and if you really don't know if you're going into a boss completely blind, he's very reliable. He's always going to be okay. A tier. Next up, Redmane Knight Oga. This hybrid summon is a little bit weaker than Kristoff. However, it's because their forms are not equal. This guy's ranged form is incredible. His arrows do super high damage and super high stagger. That being said, his melee form is a lot worse, and when the boss does get on top of him, it's pretty hard to get him to switch back into ranged form. At 106 FP, he is not cheap. All in all, it is pretty decent, and if you're really good at keeping the boss away, I think this guy is a lot of potential, but it takes a lot of skill and is not easy to do. This guy gets B tier because he doesn't get to stay in his OP form for very long. Next up, Lutel the Headless. Like the Malmuseum Soldjars, this person phases in and out of existence all the time, which helps make up for her comparatively mediocre damage and significantly lower health. However, that phasing in, while it's very good at keeping the summon alive, pretty bad at keeping you alive. A lot of the time, this drops boss aggro, sometimes in the middle of an animation, meaning that an attack that looks like it's not going to hit you will suddenly pivot 90 degrees and go straight at you. It means you really have to be on your toes. It's one of the summons that actually makes it harder for you to play the game, in my opinion. That being said, the damage is still pretty good, and the summon is still pretty tanky, and pretty good at staying alive, especially if you're buffing them. So they still eke into B tier, despite the fact that they make the game a little harder for you. Next up, Cleanrot Knight Finley. At 127 FP, this guy is such a disappointment, man. The lore on him is incredible, but in-game, he's got a lot of problems. He's a hybrid summon, and he's not really good at anything. He's kind of underwhelming damage at close range and kind of underwhelming damage at long range. Does buff you at the start of the fight, which is like nice, but it's really not that great, man. I wish this guy were better, but at 127 FP, he's really not justifying his cost compared to your other options at this high tier. I can't put him anywhere other than C. Next up, Black Knife Tish. At 132 FP, this person justifies the cost. Super nimble, super agile, but you already know why. They apply Destined Death, reduces the max health, and drains enemies for a pretty good amount. This summon is great. What is there to say, man? Black Knife Tish is amazing. Super, like, the utility of having a boss just have like 20% less max health is useful at every stage of the game, especially in New Game Plus. The health drain is pretty good damage. This might be the highest damage summon, assuming that you're actually buffing her and keeping aggro away from her. The only disadvantage she has is that she is pretty squishy. So if the boss manages to stun lock her, she's going to be in for a really bad time. But the death status effect is just so good. This is an easy S tier. Though I do think she's a little overrated. Also, for the longest time, she was bugged. That was fixed. I wasn't hallucinating. Bosses were actually healing from the gray health, and they just fixed it like a couple days ago from when this video came out. So, even better now. This summon is great. Next up, Divine Bird Warrior Ornis. This guy is pretty good. Very similar to the Horned Warrior. He costs 100 FP. Very aggressive, though one of his spells is often wasted. He shoots a bunch of little projectiles that don't do a lot. But he's fast, aggressive, high poise, high damage, keeps boss aggro. Great summon, solid A tier. He's good. Very, very similar to the Horned Warrior. He's basically just a different form of the Horned Warrior. So, next up, Telu the Golem Smith. 115 FP, this guy is, other than the Crystalian, probably the tankiest summon in the DLC. And super reliable. This guy has crazy high poise. He will face tank boss's most insane combo, hitting him the whole time. I love this dude. Legitimately, he might be my favorite summon of the entire DLC. And by God, I wish he could be S tier. But he's not. I mean, he's great, don't get me wrong. He has a ranged attack, he has high damage, and he is probably the quintessential tank summon. But he's so slow that the boss often will aggro on you for a while before they ever switch over to him. And he's not without his problems. When he is staggered, he's going to be staggered for a while. All in all, I still think this is an incredible summon. You guys gotta give him a try, but he's just A tier. Next up, Ancient Dragon Florisax. This 90 FP DLC summon is a pretty high cost to obtain because you miss out on a pretty substantial dragon incantation buffing item if you get the summon instead of that item. I won't spoil how, but there is kind of a cost to getting the summon. That being said, depending on your build, it could be very worth the effort. The support summon has a bunch of buffs, including making enemies weaker to lightning damage. So if you have a lightning build, this is an automatic amazing summon. And she casts a bunch of pretty powerful spells, both from ranged and close range, herself. It is a support summon, so this person is not going to be particularly high damage on their own, but very good supplementing you. If there's ever water in the arena, very, very good because of that extra damage lightning does when the enemy is wet. And the fact that they reduce the enemy's resistance to lightning damage. It is a situational summon. Once again, if you have no lightning in your build, the person's not really going to be that great. But if you're using it at all or just want a ranged summon, they're pretty good. I'm giving them a solid B tier. Next up, the Mimic tier. 660 hit points cost, and you guys know, Mimic tier is broken. Mimic tier is the most broken summon in the game. You can, anything that's completely broken on the player character, you can give it to the Mimic tier and it's completely broken. You have consumables that are limited use. The Mimic tier has no limit. You have spells with high FP cost. The Mimic tier has no FP. He'll use them forever. He'll heal, he'll spam weapon arts. He's great. The only thing working against this guy at all is the fact that he significantly lowers your health at the start of the fight, and he's vulnerable to attacks that can hit human-type enemies. But this guy's amazing. He did amazing on the Morgott meter, and this is with a terrible build. And Mimic tier is S tier. You guys know he's S tier. You don't need me to tell him he's S tier. If you're not using the Mimic tier and you're really stuck on a boss, use the Mimic tier, man. Look up a meta build. There's a ton of meta builds. It's amazing. The Mimic tier is S tier. I'd put him in a tier above everything else, but I'm not going to mess up the prettiness of the tier list. Next up, Finger Maiden Thurlina. This 82 FP summon is the quintessential support summon, the OG. She heals, and she throws pots. And she heals, and she buffs. It's pretty frequent. She's definitely not self-sufficient, and she definitely does die pretty fast if the boss is like really focused on her. But it's pretty easy to get the boss off, stop targeting her, and she'll heal all the way to full very frequently. But, I mean, it's just a healing support. It's the healing support. B tier. Next up, the Jarrite Puppet. At 60 FP, I feel like this summon is really slept on. The damage is very, very front-loaded, but this person throws status effect pots. A lot. And he's very reliable at proccing a bunch of different status effects because of that in very short succession. His damage is very front-loaded. Because of the way statuses work, where they become harder to apply after the first time they're applied, this guy is going to basically do less and less damage as the fight goes on, but he gives you a huge head start on the fight and has a moderately low FP cost considering everything he can do. This is another summon I think is very slept on, and I'm putting him at A tier. You guys probably ought to try him out, especially if you think you can keep the aggro off of him. Next up, Dolores the Sleeping Arrow. At 87 FP, this is a player with a longbow. She can apply sleep to bosses, yay, but her damage is low. Very, very niche, vulnerable to attacks that can hit humans. Because she dodges attacks, I'm generously putting her at C tier, but I really don't know many situations where you'd use a summon that can put the boss to sleep and then immediately wake him up. C tier. Next up, the Nepheli Puppet. At 90 FP, you kind of gotta be a little evil to get this puppet. But if you do, it's worth the reward. Nepheli has very high damage, is very tanky, and her AI is smart. She dodges, she does lightning damage. It's pretty good. I would argue Nepheli is actually straight up better than the Dung Eater, which you can't get both in a single run. I would still recommend getting the Dung Eater if you're trying to be a good person, because you have to be evil to get Nepheli, but if you do, I mean, you're rewarded. Nepheli is a great summon, and I easily put her at A tier. Next up, the Dung Eater. 118 FP, this guy is probably the quintessential alternative to Mimic tier. That being said, I don't really think he quite earns the title. He does have very good damage, is very tanky, more so than even Nepheli, and has a bunch of spells that I believe are in the Madness category, although they don't seem to really apply Madness ever, so don't rely on that. But he uses those spells quite frequently. I mean, he's a good summon. He's human type. I think one of the best at drawing and keeping aggro. So if you're a spellcaster, don't sleep on him. He can keep the bosses away from you. He's good. Not as good as Nepheli, but it is a lot more ethical to get the Dung Eater puppet. So I certainly can't fault it at all. Dung Eater, easy A tier. And the last on our list, the Night Maiden and Sorcerer puppets. At 97 FP, I wish I had more to say about these guys. They're good. They can apply bleed. Unfortunately, one of them wastes a lot of time trying to apply sleep. Until Jolan and Anna came out, these guys were pretty damn good. Unfortunately, Jolan and Anna kind of have their dynamic duo set up, but better. They do more damage than the sorceresses. Jolan and Anna really do what these guys do, but better. That being said, they still do damage pretty good. They keep aggro very, very well. Almost too well. I feel like it makes his bosses a lot more aggressive, but regardless, these guys are good. I'd recommend them if you really don't know what to run or you want a bunch of people who are pretty tanky to get the boss away from you. Another pretty good option if you're a spellcaster. Another A tier. With that, we have finished. We've ranked all of them. That means our offensive tier list looks like this. And our support tier list looks like this. Of course, you may disagree with some of my placements I've made. At least a pretty good chunk of this is opinion-based. It can't be all data. So if there's anything I miss, if there's a niche use case I failed to consider, or I overrated a summon because of a glaring weakness I've somehow missed, let me know down in the comments. And thank you for watching. If you have any more recommendations, keep tuned for the eventual beating the DLC using random summons only. That's going to take some time, if it's even possible. Spoiler alert, I'm pretty sure there's only a single summon that can beat the final boss of the DLC, so not sure that one's going to be random. Anyway, like, subscribe, or something, I don't know. I don't care.